Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers on our YouTube channel. I am your political host, Will Wright, and we're joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well, thanks.
And today we have with us, oh man, I'm going to butcher this. I normally before each episode, I try to make sure I got the phonetic spelling of the person's last name, and any listener of this program will know apparently that's something that we are not disciplined in doing. So I'm not even going to try. We've got Nick. And how do you say your last name?
That was easy enough. You did a good job.
Thanks. How do you say your last name?
Very good.
It's Troiano.
That's what I was going to guess too. Dang it. So Nick Troiano, he's the founding executive director of Unite America. It's a philanthropic venture fund that invests in nonpartisan election reform to foster a more representative and functional government. He's also the author of the book, The Primary Solution, Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes. I have the book right here for those that can see it. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Thanks so much for having me. A fan of what you guys have been doing these past few years of bridging divides. It's what we're all about here at Unite America.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Cool.
On top of Unite America being a fellow, I'm on a bad time with words today. Aside from Unite America being a philanthropic venture fund, what else does Unite America do, and what's it all about?
So, Philanthropic Venture Fund is sort of the model of our organization in terms of we raise resources, we invested in election reform campaigns and organizations around the country. And our mission is to foster a more functional and representative government, a government that's capable of solving the big challenges that's facing the country and future generations. And our theory of change is that if we want to have better outcomes, we need a better process, because our election process determines the incentives by which all of our candidates and elected officials govern or don't govern. And today, the essential dysfunction in our politics is that we're rewarding behavior we don't want. We don't like divisiveness and dysfunction, but that's exactly what our election system rewards. So if we want people who actually work together and solve problems and represent a majority of Americans, well, we need to change our elections because they're not currently doing that today.
Yeah, and we had some time ago, we had the late Congressman Donald McKeechan on, and I remember asking him this question specifically about divisiveness in America and how it's related to the behavior of our congressional representatives. And he essentially said that, the divisiveness that you see isn't necessarily, our elected officials behaving that way, and therefore their constituents are replicating their behavior. It's just the opposite. It's like, the constituents are acting a certain way, and as a result, they're going to elect people that behave that same way. So how does kind of changing, election or reforming elections help combat that?
Well, I would say it's a vicious cycle in the sense of if we give disproportionate political power to political extremists on the fringes of both parties, they're going to elect people who are out of step with the mainstream electorate. And those leaders, if you can call them that, are only going to further polarize the electorate. And that process repeats. And so we are stuck in this vicious cycle of polarization and dysfunction. The way to break it is to change our election system, to actually elect people that are more broadly representative of the public, and an election system in which we can hold them accountable to the behavior that we want. And the current problem is that our system of party primaries is not enabling that majority to express its will. Most of our elections, as you may be familiar, aren't decided in November. Most elections are over by then because these districts are so safe for Democrats or Republicans, which means that the primary is the only election that matters. Very few people turn out. Millions of independents are disenfranchised. And so what happens? You have 8% of Americans electing 83% of our Congress. That's what our research found in 2022. So it's no wonder that we get a Congress that can't agree even when a majority of us do on the issues that we care about. When you look at immigration or the budget or on climate, that's the tragedy of our politics today. Not that we, the people, are hopelessly divided, but that our Congress is, even when we're not.
That is absolutely fascinating. So the primaries, I'm hearing this concept that the primaries are kind of a little bit to blame, or at least the system for what we have right now. And the idea that 8% elect 83% of our Congress is, I've never heard that before, and that's astonishing.
Yeah.
So my question is, what help us understand the primaries for plebeians like me, and help us understand the primaries, what they are, and what is it about them that like, why is it so twisted in our current context? How have we gotten here?
Well, I'd love to go back into history a little bit, and I get into this in the book because we haven't always had a system of party primaries in our country. And that's because when the founders designed our Constitution and our framework of a constitutional republic, they didn't anticipate, in fact, they even feared political parties to begin with. The parties nonetheless rose, and it became a question of, well, how do the parties select their standard bearers for the election in which everyone else gets to decide between? So the first system that we had as a country was called the caucus and convention system, where you've heard of the party bosses in the proverbial smoke-filled rooms. They would handpick the candidates to represent their party that all the voters would then get to pick from. That became a very corrupt system. Those party bosses getting kickbacks from the politicians in office or people buying seats, etc. So reformers a century ago said, no, 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 we the people should have a say in who gets nominated from the major political parties. And so came the direct primary system. Wisconsin was the first state in 1904. A decade later, a majority of states voted this way. And for about a century, that system worked. It was a more democratic way of choosing each party's nominees. The challenge is, in the last 20 years, we've become so polarized that this primary system has been weaponized by the activists and the special interests in order to pursue and advance their agenda. And so primarying went from a noun, a party primary, to becoming a verb. When you get primaried means we're going to run someone who's more extreme than you in your election and to toss you out of office, since most of the competition's in the primary, not the general election. And that is what has gone wrong over the last 20 years, that has pushed both parties further and further apart, where there's less common ground in our Congress, meaning we can't even pass basic legislation. Last year was the least productive year in our Congress in recent memory. Not only that, the largest and fastest growing segment of the American electorate today are political independents. There are more independents than there are Democrats or Republicans, which means that this party primary system, which used to include most voters, no longer does. We're releasing a report next week that will show 23.5 million Americans who are registered independents in 22 states will not have a right to vote in the primaries for president or Congress this year. That is wrong, and that is un-American in terms of our democracy. These are publicly funded elections. And that includes the majority of young people, Gen Z and millennials. It includes nearly half of veterans who are independents. So we're telling people who fought for our country, people who are the future of our country, they don't have a voice in our democracy. You know, that's got to change. That's what's wrong with the party primary system in America today.
That's really interesting because, I mean, so we live in Virginia, and you don't necessarily have to register for a party in Virginia, which is nice, but you know, it does suck in the sense of like it's hard to kind of do a split ticket vote.
Right.
So I go, excuse me, I go in the voting cubicle or whatever, and or before I get there, I talk to a person there, and they're like, okay, you voting Democrat or Republican? And I'm just like, I don't know, like I normally vote Democrat, but there's somebody on the Republican ticket that I really like, and every time I try to grab two of them, like the police are called. So like I do hear you with regards to the independents not necessarily having a vote, and I think that's super relevant. So how do you even change that? I mean, like that's a structural issue that's been existing and has favored, one political party than the other. So there's not necessarily a lot of, I don't know, political will or capital that people want to spend on fixing it. So like how can an organization like Unite America help fix that?
Well, the reason why I like to talk about the history of how we got here is because you realize the system we have today isn't the one that we've always had. Wasn't handed down on high from our founders saying this is the way it will always be. It's changed over time. It's generally become more democratic and less corrupt. And that's unfinished business, meaning this election system can constantly be improved and innovated over time. And in fact, that's what our founders expected to do when they gave, through the Constitution, every state the right to set the time, place, and manner of their elections. And as a result of that, that's the key to fixing this system. We don't need to amend the Constitution. We don't need to pass a law through Congress. Every state can change these rules. In half the states, there's a ballot initiative process. So the citizens can sign petitions and put directly on the ballot for a vote any of these election reforms. And in the other half of states, we can lobby our state legislators to change these laws. And this has been done before. Alaska is probably the best example of this, that in 2020, citizens there ran a ballot initiative to replace their party primaries with a single nonpartisan primary. So there'd be an all-candidate ballot. Every candidate, regardless of their party affiliation, is listed on it. So to your point before, you don't have to choose just the red ballot or the blue ballot. You get a red, white, and blue ballot, and you get to choose, do I want to vote for a Republican for governor, a Democrat for state senate, etc. And under this system, the top 4 finishers for each office move to the general election. So in the general election, you don't get a binary choice just between R or D. You get multiple flavors of Democrat, Republican, third party, independent. And rather than just selecting one, you have an option of ranking those candidates in order of preference. And through an instant runoff process, if no one has a majority of support, then those votes are retabulated to identify who does. This whole system, to boil it down into one idea, is about ensuring that the candidate who wins is supported by a majority of voters, not just the slim few who vote in the dominant party's primary.
Is that system in Alaska, you think, what helped Lisa Murkowski win her election? I mean, like it was a write-in campaign too, I think, on the first one.
Yeah, in 2010, she was primaried in the Republican primary, lost, and then wound up running a write-in campaign, which showed that in a pretty spectacular way, a majority of Alaskans preferred her to the nominees of either political party. Fast forward in 2022, the same thing would have happened in the sense of, she voted to convict former President Trump in his impeachment hearing. She's worked across the aisle on issues, so the Republican Party primaried her and put up a challenge. Under this new system, though, she was one of the top 4 finishers and went to the general election nonetheless. So all voters still had the option of voting for her. And guess what? A majority did. And so she was reelected. Juxtapose that with the other Republicans who voted to impeach Trump for trying to overturn an election in the last presidential election. All of them either didn't run, got primaried, or lost reelection, except for 2 in the House that come from states without party primaries. And this isn't a partisan issue because you can look at the Democratic side and there's a representative named Kurt Schrader who was primaried out of office in Oregon, which has closed primaries. He was a Democrat who worked across the aisle, part of the House Problem Solvers Caucus. He was primaried by a more progressive candidate who wound up then losing the general election in his district because she was so far out of step with the mainstream of voters. And this is part of the point that I make, that the primary system not only fails the voters, it fails the political parties because they wind up nominating candidates who are far to the left or to the right and then go on to lose general elections. And that's why I think it's both in the interest of the voters and the parties that we design a better system.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me as you're saying it. And I just want to make sure I understand exactly what you're saying. And I know that you outline this in the book, but what I'm trying to figure out is that, so what I hear you saying is that essentially, if you're not part of the, party agenda, you're not aligning, people, whoever they are, the guys smoking cigars in the back room, say, hey, Bertram's not part of the agenda anymore. He's not lining up. Let's get someone more radical and let's get him off the ballot in the state. That's
Exactly.
what.
They have used the
So
primary process as a sort of loyalty test. If you're not voting with your party, if you're not hewing, sort of the ideological line on your side, the only threat that you face to reelection is someone running against you from your own party, because most of these districts
yes,
are so uncompetitive.
and they're so uncompetitive because of gerrymandering.
In part, in part. The other big part of this is that the voting electorate has sorted ourselves so much geographically, meaning conservatives tend to live in more rural areas, progressives
They
tend to
like
live
to
in more
be with
urban
conservatives.
areas. And so even if you had perfectly fair redistricting and maps, you would still wind up with most districts being solidly blue or solidly red. And so you can solve the problem of gerrymandering and be left with the primary problem, which is why, in my belief, addressing primaries is the most important thing we can do to get a more representative democracy today.
It's more important than gerrymandering, is what I'm hearing you say, and I've never heard anyone say that.
Yes,
That
I
the
mean, when you ask
primary
people, I
is
begin my
more
book saying,
important.
when you ask people what's wrong with politics today, most of them say the people. So they're not even thinking about the system or incentives. We're just focusing on Marjorie
Blaming
Taylor Greene.
ourselves
We're
or
focusing
whoever
on,
the other person.
yep,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, we can change all 535 people tomorrow, and we'd wind up with as just as much dysfunctional mess than we're in today because of the underlying incentives of the system. Now, what do we do about that? People talk about money in politics, term limits, the electoral college, the list goes on. There are many important things we should do. The most important thing that is both possible and powerful is going to be to address this primary problem. And that's the mission that I'm on in writing this book, because that's not a very popular view today. We've come to accept that this system is what we've always had, what we always will have, but that's not true. And luckily, multiple states have already taken it into their own hands to show that there is a better way. I think the rest of America can vote like Alaska, and we'd have a much healthier democracy.
So I love that. That makes a lot of sense to me. It's like, hey, why should, because I always sit here and wonder what is happening that these are the people that we have to vote for. I don't understand this, because almost everyone I talk to, they're like, I'm not crazy about the guy. I'm thinking about Trump here, but he's the option. What are we going to go with, Biden? And I have all these guys. So, that's kind of the circles like I run in politically. So I've always wondered about this, and it's absolutely fascinating. So let's think about this for a moment, though. Alaska, right? Alaska, that's great, but that's Alaska, and Alaskans, no, offense to Alaskans, no offense to those in Maine, but how is this going to work in DC, Maryland, Virginia? How is it going to work in California, in Florida, in Texas? Walk me through. So I'm here, I'm Johnny wants to change the world, and I got to figure out how to change primaries. What do I do in Virginia to make this a reality?
Well, the good news is that there's something to do in basically every state to improve this process, with Alaska being sort of the North Star and having solved this problem. The worst
I love that, by the way.
The worst offenders are the 15 states with closed party primaries, which means that only Republicans can vote in the GOP primary, only Democrats can vote in their own. If you're an independent, you can't vote in either. So the thing to do in those states is to give everyone the right to vote in every publicly funded election. In the rest of states that have open or semi-open primaries, where you can have some flexibility of picking which party's primary to vote in, we want to move those states to an Alaska-style model with an all-candidate primary, so that you don't have to choose your red or blue ballot. You choose a ballot that has all the candidates on it. And 5 states have done this for federal or state office. We talked about Alaska, but there's also California, Washington State, Louisiana, and Nebraska. And so you've heard of this laboratories of democracy before. There's an approach in which every state can experiment with a slightly different model about how to do this. For example, in Louisiana, they don't have primaries. In California and Washington, they have a top 2 system, so advancing just two candidates, two top finishers to the general election. No matter what model we're talking about, the worst that can possibly exist is one not only where you have party primaries, but that they're closed to independents. And so no matter where you are, there's something for you to do to get involved. Supporting a ballot initiative, there's going to be about a half dozen states with ballot initiatives this year, or getting involved and talking to your state legislator about making this improvement. And there are more states that are working on that across the country as well.
So maybe we can, take some of what you just said and apply it to, maybe more recent issues, specifically that's been in the news. So, like, let's take immigration, for instance. I know you address this in your book. So I've got two questions for you. One, like, why is their immigration system broken, and why do you think this most recent border security bill that seemed to have fairly broad support by a lot of the stakeholders involved, Border Patrol and most of Americans, like, why would a bill like that not pass?
It's a great question. I would say there are two challenges in our politics right now, which are symptoms of this underlying problem we've been talking about. The first is that we're often put in these false binary choices, right? To solve a $30 trillion debt, do you want to raise more revenue or do you want to cut spending? Not both, right? You can't do both. Or on our immigration challenge, do you want to secure the border or do you want a path to legal status for the millions of undocumented Americans who are here? And I think most reasonable people will look at these problems and say, there's a compromise to be had. There's some common ground to be had. It's not as black and white. But the political parties have divided us into these false binaries, because if they should cross the aisle to make a compromise, they're now vulnerable to getting primaried for breaking their party orthodoxy. The second problem, besides this false binaries, is the fact that some issues are more valuable politically left unsolved than if they are solved, right? With a $30 trillion debt, Republicans can run on, oh, look at how fiscally reckless the current administration is, right? Or with the border or an immigration system that has millions of undocumented Americans here, including dreamers that were brought here as children, Democrats can use that as an issue of saying, look what Republicans won't solve. And in both cases, we've seen how that prevents actual problem solving. And why is that? Is because our politics reward it. 90% of our members of Congress have consistently been reelected, despite congressional approval being around 20% or lower over the past couple of decades. There's no real leverage right now for voters to hold their elected leaders accountable by virtue of the election system that we currently have. And that's the problem. That's the problem that's at the core of all of our other problems. And immigration, I think, is a good example. What I do write about in the book is that a decade ago, we had an opportunity to do something big on this issue. There was 60 plus votes in the Senate for a bipartisan bill. When that bill got over to the House, the majority leader at the time, Eric Cantor, expressed some openness to taking it piece by piece and putting it to the floor for votes. That was unacceptable to his base. He got primaried and lost his election, which sent a shockwave through the Republican Party at the time, and that bill never saw the light of day. A couple years later, the problem got even worse. On one side of the aisle, it's build the wall. On the other side of the aisle, it's abolish ICE. And so we're stuck between two bumper stickers with a real problem in our country. A humanitarian crisis, a national security crisis, and our politics isn't up to the task of solving it. If you feel frustrated by that, we can't just look and blame the individual politicians. We have to be looking deeper and saying, what's wrong with this process? That we can keep changing the people, but we get the same outcome every time. Repeating that is the definition of insanity. So here we are needing to look at ways of addressing this in a much more systemic way.
Yeah, it's I appreciate you saying that some of these problems perhaps aren't necessarily rushed to get solved because it's not maybe politically advantageous. I remember posting something on social media recently about like Congress can work when they put their mind to it. I mean, like look at COVID, like
Right.
when we had COVID, I mean, and it was even under Trump presidency, like everybody was sort of, paddling the boat in the same direction to try to like, keep lives from being lost to this like disease. So it can work, but I'm curious if kind of part of your thought process about reforming elections has anything or has any connection to um, term limits, which I think you alluded to a little bit earlier, and more specifically like term limits, especially in the House. I mean, with a 2-year re-election cycle for all House members, it's almost like once they get elected and they find out where the copy paper is stored, they're immediately in sort of fundraising mode, like a
Yeah.
year or 2 years out, and it's like it just seems like it's a cycle where you're looking for issues to fundraise off of because
Right.
you want to get reelected. So I'd love to kind of get your take on that.
Well, you're raising a good question of both term length and term limits, right? Term length of 2 years is quite short. It maybe made sense when sort of news traveled by telegram or horseback, and the way that things operate so quickly today, it may be something to look at, because you're right. I'm not even sure that they stop campaigning to find the copy paper. I think the campaign does not stop, at least for those that are actually representing competitive districts. Then there's this separate question of, should there be a limit on how many terms they should serve? Because what we're seeing is that we're having more and more career politicians, and what I did my sort of senior thesis on, a gerontocracy, which is basically a fancy word of saying rule by the elderly, right? The average age of a member of Congress gets older and older every year. And that's not a great way of being able to have leaders who understand and can address problems of the future, from artificial intelligence and beyond. Now, there's a downside to term limits of, do you replace people who are just getting the sense of how to legislate, to learn the issues, to build relationships? If you take them out too soon, you replace them basically with a professional lobbying class who then can take over the legislature. That's what we've seen in some state legislators that have done term limits. So in my mind, just to sum it up, I don't think you need term limits if you have truly competitive elections in which voters can hold their leaders accountable. Term limits seem like a blunt force instrument as a way of saying we have no other hope of accountability except to limit them. But I think that's removing some agency for voters, because there's plenty of circumstances in which a voter might want their leader to continue to serve. So I think there may be a happy medium of setting a term limit length that doesn't outsource the expertise of our governing institutions to the professional lobbying class, but on the other hand, gets us out of this system in which people have become too attached to their title, to their role, to their position, that they forget what they're there to do, and to take some risks to do what is in the good interest of the country, even if that may be unpopular among their own party.
So I love this. Say you have someone that comes up to you and they're like, look, Nick, I know that we would love to reform, this political monster that we have, but it's just the best that we can do. And we all know that these elections are corrupt anyway. So why, there's got to be a different way. So maybe it's addressing two people. One that says, these elections are corrupt. It doesn't matter what you do. It's not going to change anything. It's just human nature. And then the other person that would basically say something like, yeah, I just want to keep this status quo. It's all good. We don't need to change. Change is going to create too many issues. It's going to open up vacuums of power. I don't want to do. How do you respond to people that come? Because what I'm trying to do is this is just like a normal person, the way they see politics, the way I don't even want to be involved in it.
Right.
I just want to wipe my hands of it. It doesn't affect my life anyway. And yet we're trying to say, no, wait, it does, or and if it doesn't, it will
Right.
very soon. So what's your response to those kinds of things? And that those are caricatures for sure. But what is your response?
Well, no doubt they're shared by millions of Americans who've become so disaffected or disillusioned by our politics, it's driven them to the point of cynicism. However, I would say that we have something very special here in our country. We often call our government the American experiment. It is an experiment.
Yes.
This goes against human nature. This is something that we have innovated on, that our country is the oldest constitutional democracy in the world. And we should not take that for granted, because what does the
Yes.
alternative look like? It looks like a society
Yes.
without freedom, without individual rights, without the ability to make collective decisions on public policy. It looks like what humans have been familiar with for most of our existence, which is might makes right, which is violence as a means of solving problems, not shared governance.
Yes.
So we should not take for granted this system that we have, which relies on us as citizens holding what I think is the most important office in being able to decide who should represent us and in holding those leaders accountable. If we exit that system, I guarantee you it gets worse, and I guarantee you it's not sustainable. And I don't think we want to be the generation that loses this for many
No.
generations to come. We have a responsibility to get that right, and plenty of Americans have put their lives on the line and sacrificed for that. So who are we to say that, oh, it's actually too much to go cast a ballot or to make our ballot actually matter?
Mm.
That gets me a little revved up.
I love that.
The other of let's just accept the status quo is how's that working out for us? You know, there's a reason why
Yeah.
congressional approval's at 20%, record high levels of distrust and dissatisfaction in our institutions. Not only that, the other thing that I'm pretty concerned about is the level of hatred across party lines, right? We no longer see the other side as people we disagree with. We increasingly think that they're evil, and that can justify a whole bunch of bad actions, right? In a society, it's destabilizing in many ways. Let's not be pawns in that kind of system that, as one author calls them, conflict entrepreneurs are waging, right? Division has become a business model. It's a business model for clicks and views in media. It's for small donations to politicians who want to raise money off of outrage. It's part of the algorithms of our social media channels. That's all incentivizing us to look at our own neighbors as enemies, and we shouldn't play into that. And so I would just say the status quo is not working out, and we shouldn't accept it. And the thing is, let's not lose sight of the agency we have to do something about it. Because when I look at states that have fixed this problem, it wasn't the result of the political establishment. It was the result of citizens rising up to do something about that. And so let's not underestimate the power that we have either.
Nick, I'm curious, and don't take this question the wrong way, but like,
Sure.
how old are you?
34.
See, like, I think that's amazing. I mean, I'm 47, I think. I actually have a birthday coming this Sunday. But like, I look at somebody like you, younger than I am, older than my kids, but younger than I am, and like, you have developed, you know, this organization. You're really engaged. You wrote a book. Like what prompted you to kind of be this passionate about our election systems?
Just that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I've just had a pretty unique opportunity from studying politics in DC and getting involved early on in political reform to see a system that is designed to produce the outcomes that it is today, right? It's not a surprise that we're sitting here wondering why we can't make progress on issues or getting increasingly divided.
Yeah.
Once you see that it's built into the design, there's an outrage there of, well, that's not a great thing. And also, this belief and conviction that, well, this is fixable. And so once you realize the nature of the problem that underlies so many of the symptoms that we spend our time talking about, and that that problem is solvable, for people like me, that means, well, then you have to go do something about that. And it's been a rewarding journey to be able to find myself into a position where there's an increasing number of people who care about this and want to do something about that. And if I can use my time and skills to marshal that towards actually creating change, not just writing a book, but in getting people to volunteer or to contribute or to lead these efforts, it's an impact that I'd be glad to have. And I feel like, and I know I am, standing on the shoulders of many people who've dedicated their lives to these issues for much longer periods of time. And it's on the back of a tradition in our country of doing that. I mean, that's what we've been doing since the founding. So it's motivating to me and rewarding.
That's pretty amazing. Okay, so you mentioned something about people wanting to take action, and a lot of what you have said so far, I'm like gung ho. Like, let's do it. Sign me up. Like, where do I start? So I'm curious. Like, give us a roadmap, if you will, of how somebody like me, can help fix, like, the primary system or election systems. I mean, ostensibly, we would be trying to correct something that is overseen by people that we vote for. And, sort of in the name of self-preservation, I don't think Congress members are necessarily all that excited about, like term limits or
Right.
changing the election system in such a way that is not going to benefit them personally. So give me that roadmap on how I can, make my vote count or put ballot initiatives, that people can vote on.
Yeah. Well, first, I would encourage people to get familiar with a few of the organizations that can help connect you to a local effort. There are groups like Represent Us, Open Primaries, Fair Vote, Rank the Vote. If you're a veteran, there's Veterans for All Voters. So these groups, which are listed at uniteamerica.org, are all pathways of engagement, depending on which policy that you support or which geography that you inhabit. But I would say, for inspiration, look at some of the initiatives that have actually worked. I mean, one of the best examples is in Michigan, where a campaign led by someone who was younger than me at the time, Katie Fahey, wound up starting a citizen-led initiative to fix the gerrymandering problem in her state. It began with a Facebook post, led to people grabbing clipboards to get signatures for an initiative to establish an independent commission. They amended their state's constitution, and it was citizens rising up who did that. So that's
awesome.
possible in a state, as are these legislative efforts. In Pennsylvania, the state where I'm from, there's a group called Ballot PA, led by a guy named David Thornburg, and he's getting other independents in Pennsylvania and Democrats and Republicans together to lobby their state legislature to say, basically, let us vote. Let the close to 1.5 million voters in Pennsylvania who aren't Democrats or Republicans participate in the elections where the candidates are nominated, and in the elections that might be the only elections that actually matter. And so there are these grassroots efforts in states that you can join, and everyone has a state representative and state senator. I mean, those are the people that are closest to you. They don't have millions of constituents, they have thousands. I'm telling you, if you get 25 of your friends together and you go visit them or write a letter or start writing op-eds, they're going to pay attention to you. And that's the work that needs to be done. And the last thing I would say is that there's a knee-jerk opposition among elected officials to these ideas because they're familiar with the system that got themselves into power. But don't underestimate the fact that most people who run, at least initially, do so for good reasons. They are running to serve their communities and to solve problems, and they feel trapped by this system as well. They feel like they are not able to have the political latitude they need to do their jobs and keep their job. So they wind up saying and rationalizing with themselves, well, I won't do what I know a majority of my citizens want, because I need to be able to get in to do one more term, to do a little bit more of this, right? And that just becomes a cycle that they're stuck in. So
Sure.
when I think about passing these reforms, I think about liberating those leaders from the handcuffs that they're in right now because of our current election system.
And that's fascinating to me. And I absolutely love this conversation. Will and I, there's a little bit of behind the scenes. We'll text back and forth while we're interviewing just to make sure we're on the same page and, we're not talking over each other and stuff like that. And I just sent him like, man, we got to do something like this in Virginia. That's what I just sent to him. Maybe it's part of our calling, because we feel like God brought us together. I mean, this isn't an expressly Christian podcast, but we're both Christians. And we both have this sense of divine calling and things like that. And it's, you hit on something though, that really resonates inside, because I see the biggest problem as I'm just looking at my friends, people I've pastored over the years, people I know dearly and love dearly. And a lot of times I'll think several of them from all over. I feel like, man, how can they think that? How can they feel that way? I mean, don't they realize they're being, duped? And it just feels like there's sometimes very little critical thinking and all that. But it's like we can put all of this like, oh, it's because people don't, think critically enough. They're not good at looking at different news. But I think most people are in large part reasonable. And I think there's a hopelessness that we can actually make a change. And you hit something with the agency. When you said it, it was like an alarm went off in my head, or this idea like ding, 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 that's it. Because we don't feel like we have any political agency to make any change. And we're just puppets being led by the puppet master. And so we have these candidates we don't want. They're almost 80. I mean, I can't say that for Trump. That's a whole nother thing that we're coming out with an entire documentary series that we've been talking about that's going to deal with some of those things with what's going on with Trump. We have people that talked about the cult of Trump. I don't get it, but I have people good friends that I love that actually love him. And I'm going to get off that right now, but it's just, we have these people that are like, how can this be it?
Right.
How can this be it? I don't feel represented in any way by the Republican Party in many ways right now. I feel like I've been a Republican my entire life. I voted Republican in every single election except last election. And I voted Republican in every other issue in the last election, just not presidential. I went independent. And I'm just like, it drives me crazy to think now that I'm a political orphan or a political, I'm just in no man's land. Like, I don't know. I can't jump on the MAGA train. I can't go riding with Biden. So what do I have to do? I just have to, I don't know, write someone in. I mean, it just feels like a wasted vote. Anyway, I'll get off this, high horse that I'm on right now. It feels like a losing battle. And I would love for you to, and you've already addressed it really well, but again, bring some life into people. Like, for instance, I want to get involved. Let's say Will and I, we want to get this, we want to get signatures. Politics feels like such a dirty game. And it feels like as soon as you're there and as soon as you're putting yourself up against the powers that be, you're going to get ruined.
Right.
And I don't know, in your experience, what you've seen that you can help encourage people like, you may get ruined, but it's worth it. Or they're trying to scare you, but it's not, that's not what happens. Whatever it is that comes to your mind as I'm talking, I'd love to get your response to that.
Yeah, I would just say what comes to my mind is that we're not alone. I think like most people, regardless of their individual political beliefs, feel let down by this very broken system. And so that gives us in aggregate the power to fix it. What we have to do is put our individual differences, political differences aside in order to do that. To say there's something more important than the R or D who might be running for this office or that. To take a step back and say, let's think about, is this really the best system that's serving all of us? Or are we locked into this trench warfare while we ignore sort of the larger battle that we're engaged in, which is the ability to have a representative democracy? And I would say even in your backyard of Virginia, there's been a good demonstration that that's possible. For 10 years, there was a group called One Virginia 2021, founded or led initially by my colleague now, Matt Scoble, who set a goal that by after the 2021 redistricting cycle, there would be no more gerrymandering in the state, that an independent commission would instead draw these lines. And for a decade, they worked at it. They had to get the legislature to vote in 2 consecutive sessions to put a ballot initiative to the voters to amend the state's constitution. And in one of those sessions, the Democrats were for it because they happened to be in the minority and weren't going to write the maps or draw the maps. In the next session, they were against it because they actually won the majority. So like, it just goes to show that this was not a DRR issue. It was just an issue of who's in power or who's not. But despite those circumstances, this group was successful, and that initiative was passed by over 60% of voters in Virginia. So we are not alone in wanting a better system. And it's only by joining together across lines of political difference that we're going to be able to succeed in building a system that we deserve as Americans and not just accepting it as it is today.
So my last question for you, Nick, is, how can people get connected to Unite America? How can they get more involved? What sort of like projects are you all working on?
Sure. Well, there's good activity happening in many states across the country. Upvote Virginia, for example, is a group that people in Virginia can get involved in. Or, like I mentioned, there are some 6 states that may have ballot initiatives for this reform. So you can find those resources at uniteamerica.org. I, of course, would encourage people who are interested in learning more about this issue or sharing it with a friend to buy a copy of the book, The Primary Solution. It comes out February 27th. And to help spread the word, there are online resources we can use to do that. This is going to be a very divisive election year, of course. The stakes are high, especially at the presidential level. But let's not lose sight that we're going to be back here in 2026 and 2028 and 2030. And we should also be thinking about long-term how to have an election system in which we're not stuck with this lesser of two evils choice in perpetuity. We don't have to accept that as our new normal in this country.
That's so true. I mean, because change is going to be more of a marathon, right, than a sprint. And and it's one of those things where I always tell people that everybody wants better, but nobody wants change. And in order to get better, you have to have change. So I appreciate what Unite America is doing in trying to change our election systems, and I just wish you and your team just all the luck, and we'll be looking forward to seeing all the different changes you do for the country. So thanks for your time, Nick.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate this.
Well, thank you for modeling, Will and Josh, what this movement is really all about. There's something bigger than just our own individual political beliefs in this grand American experiment in which we're engaged.
Awesome. Well, to our listeners and viewers, as always, keep your conversations not right, not left, but up, and we'll see you next time. Take care.